Colonel Potter, sir, my last wish is to be buried in my mother's wedding gown.
I've seen these Dodgers for 40 years. All the tricks. Dismissed!
There are television shows, and then there are television institutions. MASH was the latter. For 11 seasons, from 1972 to 1983, it occupied a rare space in American culture, a place where laughter and grief existed side by side, where a show about a fictional Korean War became the defining voice of a generation wrestling with Vietnam. It wasn't just a comedy. It wasn't just a drama. It was something entirely new, and audiences felt that in their bones every single week. But here's the thing about a show that runs for over a decade. People leave. Some go quietly. Some go loudly. Some go with tears and standing ovations. And others simply vanish between seasons without so much as a goodbye scene. And in the case of MASH, each departure told a story just as compelling as anything written into the scripts. These were real people navigating real ambitions, real exhaustion, real creative frustrations, and real personal crises, all while playing characters that millions of Americans had welcomed into their living rooms. So today, we're going to look at the real reasons why some of MASH's most beloved actors walked away from one of the greatest television shows ever made. The answers are complicated, deeply human, and in some cases genuinely heartbreaking. Let's start with the departure that, to this day, remains one of the most shocking moments in television history. McLean Stevenson played Colonel Henry Blake, the warm-hearted, endearingly bumbling commanding officer of the 4077th. From the very first season, his character was a fan favorite. Henry Blake wasn't a hero in any traditional sense. He was nervous, easily manipulated, and often out of his depth. But he was genuine, and audiences adored him for it. In 1974, McLean's performance earned him a Golden Globe nomination, and it seemed like he had found a role of a lifetime. Except McLean didn't see it that way. Behind the scenes, he was growing increasingly restless. As Alan Alda's Hawkeye Pierce began to evolve into the moral and emotional center of the show, the creative energy naturally tilted in Alda's direction. Alda, who was not only a gifted actor, but also a writer and eventually a director on the series, became more and more influential in shaping where the show went. For McLean, this shift was difficult to ignore. He had come to MASH hoping to be a leading man, and increasingly he felt like a supporting player in someone else's story. In interviews from the mid-1970s, McLean spoke openly about his desire to headline his own show. He believed he had the talent and the charm to carry a series on his own terms, and the only way to test that belief was to leave MASH and find out. It was an ambition that, depending on how you look at it, was either brave or miscalculated. What made his exit truly unforgettable, though, was what the writers did with it. When McLean announced he wouldn't be returning for Season 4, the producers faced a choice: write Henry Blake off gently, the way most shows would, or use the moment to say something real about war. They chose the latter. In the Season 3 finale, titled Abyssinia, Henry, the beloved colonel, receives his discharge papers and prepares to go home. The episode is filled with warmth and joy and the kind of genuine emotion that MASH did better than almost any show of its era. And then, in the final moments, Radar walks into the operating room, hat in hand, and delivers the news that Henry Blake's plane was shot down over the Sea of Japan and there were no survivors. The cast's reaction was real. Most of them hadn't been told how the episode would end. The silence that followed in that operating room wasn't acting. It was genuine shock. And when it aired, the nation felt it too. CBS was flooded with viewer letters. Some praised the show's unflinching honesty. Others were furious. But nobody was indifferent. As for McLean, his post-MASH career never reached the heights he had hoped for. The sitcoms he starred in following his departure, including projects built specifically around his personality, failed to connect with audiences. By the early 1980s, he had publicly acknowledged that leaving MASH had been the wrong decision. The show he walked away from turned out to be the pinnacle of his career, not a stepping stone. He passed away in 1996, remembered warmly by his former castmates and by a generation of fans who never quite forgave the Sea of Japan for taking Henry Blake. If McLean Stevenson's departure was dramatic and emotional, Wayne Rogers' exit was something quieter and, in its own way, even more telling. Wayne played Trapper John McIntyre, the fast-talking, rule-breaking surgical partner to Hawkeye Pierce. In the early seasons of MASH, Trapper and Hawkeye were the show. Their chemistry was electric, their banter sharp, and their friendship felt genuinely lived in. Watching them work was like watching two people who had been friends their entire lives. But the dynamic was never quite as equal as it appeared on screen. Wayne had come into MASH with the understanding that it would be a true ensemble production, that the core characters would share the spotlight roughly equally. What happened instead was that Hawkeye became the undisputed center of gravity, and Trapper began to orbit around him rather than stand beside him. As Alda took on a more active creative role behind the scenes, his character naturally deepened and grew. Trapper, by contrast, was given less and less room to evolve. He remained funny, charming, and quick with a quip, but he wasn't going anywhere as a character. Wayne later described it plainly. Trapper had gone from being a co-lead to someone who largely existed to react to what Hawkeye was doing. For an actor of Wayne's intelligence, and he was genuinely, exceptionally intelligent, having studied history at Princeton before pursuing acting, this stagnation was creatively unacceptable. He didn't want to spend his days nodding along at someone else's lines. What makes his exit particularly interesting is the contractual dimension. Unlike most television actors of the era, Wayne Rogers had never formally signed his contract with the show. He had been working on an informal agreement, and when the time came for season 4, he simply chose not to return. When the producers threatened legal action, they quickly discovered they had no grounds. There was nothing formal to breach. Wayne walked away clean, leaving the writers scrambling to explain Trapper's absence before cameras rolled on the new season. The explanation was handled economically in the season 4 premiere. Trapper had received his discharge while Hawkeye was away on leave, and the two never got to say goodbye. It was by design or accident, a strangely fitting end for a character who had always been somewhat undervalued. Trapper John deserved better from the show, and perhaps the abruptness of his written exit reflected that. His replacement, B.J. Honeycutt, played by Mike Farrell, was deliberately written as a different kind of character. Where Trapper was irreverent and instinctively rebellious, B.J. was more thoughtful, more emotionally complex, and more willing to sit with the weight of what war actually meant. The show changed with that substitution, arguably becoming more mature and more sophisticated. Some fans never forgave the swap. Others believe it was the evolution MASH needed. Wayne himself moved on with characteristic pragmatism. He built a highly successful second career as a financial investor and market commentator, eventually becoming a recognizable voice on television business programming. He had always been a smart man, and he applied that intelligence to a field where it rewarded him handsomely. When he passed away in 2015, Alan Alda remembered him with genuine warmth, describing a friendship that had survived the complications of their shared professional history. Of all the departures in MASH's long history, perhaps none was more emotionally layered than Gary Berghoff's. He played Corporal Walter Radar O'Reilly, the gentle, wide-eyed company clerk who could hear the helicopters coming before anyone else, who slept with a teddy bear, and who carried a sweetness so pure it seemed almost impossible in the middle of a war zone. Radar was the conscience of the 4077th, the soul the other characters sometimes forgot they had. Gary was also unique among the cast in one significant way. He was the only actor to reprise his role from the original 1970 film adaptation. He had helped invent Radar, had shaped the character from the ground up, and when he brought that creation to television, he elevated it into something truly iconic. But the personal cost was enormous. Gary was, by his own account, a perfectionist who felt things deeply, and the relentless production schedule of a network television series ground on him in ways that aren't always visible from the outside. He struggled with anxiety and periods of depression throughout the later years of his time on the show. The long hours meant extended separation from his family, and he later spoke with real regret about the time he missed with his daughter during her early years, time he could never get back. There were also professional frustrations. Gary felt, with some justification, that his contributions to the show weren't always recognized in proportion to their value. Radar was central to the emotional texture of MASH in ways that were sometimes taken for granted. His castmates respected him enormously, but the industry's formal recognition didn't always reflect that. Contract negotiations became difficult, and while the producers made accommodations, reducing his required appearances, granting additional time away from set, it wasn't enough to address the deeper exhaustion he was carrying. By season 8, Gary had made his decision. He was done. His farewell, however, was given the weight it deserved. The two-part episode titled Goodbye, Radar, gave the character a proper send-off, a final chapter in which Radar comes to understand that it's time to go home. The closing image of that episode, Radar walking away silhouetted against the Korean sky, his teddy bear left behind on Hawkeye's bunk, is one of the most quietly devastating moments the show ever produced. After MASH, Gary stepped back from the entertainment industry almost entirely. He devoted himself to painting, to wildlife conservation, and, in one of those wonderfully unexpected biographical details, to inventing, eventually holding several patents. He described his departure as necessary for both his family and his mental health. He needed to reassemble the pieces of a life that the demands of fame and the emotional intensity of the show had scattered. Here is a departure that doesn't get discussed as often as it should, perhaps because Frank Burns was a character audiences were conditioned to root against. Larry Linville played Major Frank Burns for 5 seasons, and he played him brilliantly. Frank was petty, self-righteous, cowardly, and deeply insecure. A man whose rigid obedience to authority masked a profound personal inadequacy. He was the perfect comic foil, and Larry brought a commitment to the role that elevated it well beyond what the scripts alone could have achieved. The problem was that Frank never changed. While other characters on MASH went through genuine transformations, Hawkeye deepened, Margaret evolved, even Henry Blake grew more three-dimensional over time. Frank Burns remained exactly who he had always been. The insecurities didn't develop. The prejudices didn't soften. The character was locked in place, a recurring punchline rather than a person. Larry Linville was an actor with real range, trained in classical theater, and capable of far more nuance than Frank's one-note function allowed. By the end of season 5, he had reached the honest conclusion that there was simply nowhere left to take the character. He hadn't been fired. He wasn't asked to leave. He made the decision himself, recognizing that MASH had outgrown Frank Burns even if the audience hadn't fully realized it yet.